Good evening to everyone, and welcome to the inaugural event of Jews for Judaism, Jerusalem. My name is Darryl Frankel, and I'm the Director of Jews for Judaism from South Africa. So you'll excuse my accent, I'm sure you're familiar with Jerusalem. Just a couple of housekeeping points before we continue. Just to please everybody to turn off your cell phones. And a special request from Penina, if you have any questions, please to write them down. There will be an opportunity at the end to ask questions. So please just make a note of them and we'll discuss them at the end. Is that a cell phone?
Turn off.
Okay. I'm going to talk into the mic so I hope everybody can hear me. It's my honor and pleasure to be here this evening to help mark the opening of Jews for Judaism's Jerusalem branch, a much needed presence in the Holy Land. By the end of this evening, which promises to be both inspirational and enlightening, it is our hope you will better understand why we feel that this is such a benchmark event occurring at a crucial time and in a very important place. For those of you who are not familiar with our organization, Jews for Judaism was founded in 1983 as a response to the multi-million-dollar efforts of cults and evangelical Christians who target Jews for conversion. We are an international organization that provides a wide variety of counseling services, along with education and outreach programs that enable Jews of all ages and backgrounds to rediscover and strengthen their Jewish heritage. Tonight we are privileged to hear from two renowned and captivating speakers, Penina Taylor, Executive Director of the new Jerusalem branch of Jews for Judaism, and Rabbi Ben-Zion Kravitz, or Kravitz from South Africa. Rabbi Kravitz is the founding director of Jews for Judaism International and is the Executive Director of the Los Angeles branch of Jews for Judaism. Before I continue, just a very, very huge, big thank you to the OU Center for co-sponsoring tonight's program, and especially to Phil Chanovsky for recognizing the huge need for programs like ours in Israel. Our first speaker tonight is Penina Taylor, who will be telling us the story of her spiritual journey. Penina began her speaking career at the age of 16, giving her testimony in churches all over the East Coast. She obtained a Bible certificate from Miami Christian College and served as a counselor for the Billy Graham Crusade. Congregational co-leader, worship leader, head of women's ministry, and head of the deaf ministry at a variety of churches and Hebrew Christian congregations. Our speaker has been sought after to teach evangelism classes as well as the Hebrew roots of the Christian faith. She has led Passover Seder's in churches where hundreds have attended her Messianic Passover Haggadah, and her Messianic Passover Haggadah is still in use in several churches and Hebrew Christian congregations even today. Now, having heard that, ladies and gentlemen, do you not feel that those are strange qualifications for a speaker about to address an audience at an OU center in Jerusalem? After 17 years in leadership in the Christian and Hebrew Christian communities, Penina Taylor's studies brought her to a revelation that turned her world upside down. And 8 years ago, Penina Taylor embraced the faith of her forefathers by returning to Judaism. Now, as the director of Jews for Judaism Jerusalem, Penina regularly answers questions for Jews and non-Jews alike about why Judaism rejects the notion that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah. She also offers support to families of people who have converted to another religion, as well as having had the privilege of aiding several Hebrew Christians in finding their way back home. Many of us have encountered well-meaning missionaries who try to persuade us that we need to look to Christianity or another faith in order to have a relationship with God. But we know that's not really true. In fact, that's not true at all. Our speaker this evening wants to make sure that all Jews understand this. Our speaker this evening considers it her personal mission to show us that we can have a deep, meaningful, and relevant relationship with God within the context of Judaism. Exit counselor, support group facilitator, counter missionary, educator and presenter. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Amina Taylor.
Thank you, Daryl. Good evening, everybody. What a wonderful turnout we have tonight. I hope everybody can see me as I sit down here. I feel much more comfortable down on the same level as everyone else rather than behind this box. One of the things, if you get to know me, you'll learn that I can't be put in or behind a box. So tonight I'm going to tell you a little bit about my personal story and what brings me here tonight. I was born into a secular Jewish household. Now, we knew that we were Jewish, but Judaism meant to me, it explained why I had a big nose, why I talked with my hands, and why I liked Chinese food. Other than that, Judaism had no relevance whatsoever to me in my life. It certainly didn't offer any concepts of, future personal advancement, financial freedom, or any other thing that a philosophy that you would adopt and hold on to would hold. To me, Judaism meant nothing except that it was an ethnic heritage that I had. It was something old and ancient, something to be remembered, perhaps, but certainly nothing worth embracing, nothing that I could hang a hat on, so to speak. It was within this environment that I grew up. I had the privilege of attending a Hebrew day school for 2 years. It was because of the kindness and graciousness of the rabbis of the community that we lived in that I was allowed to go to these schools, into the school. But unfortunately, nothing I learned there stuck because it wasn't being reinforced at home. It made no sense to me. So, because of some childhood traumas and other things that went on, by the time I reached high school, I reached a very difficult place in my life. I didn't think that there was any hope, that there was any light at the end of the tunnel. I just knew that my life was going down deeper and deeper into this abyss that I was in. It was in this context that I met a girl in my high school PE class. PE stands for physical education. And she told me that she understood exactly what was going on. She understood why I was hopeless, why I felt like there was nothing worth living for. She said that I was no different from anyone else because we were all sinners, and that what I needed was a relationship with God. Now, she was right. At the time, I didn't know, but I recognized that what she said was the truth, and I was introduced to God and Jesus. And so in high school, I accepted Jesus as my personal Lord and Savior. Excuse me. So in high school, I became a Christian. And you know what? It was very interesting because my embracing this new faith gave me a strength to do things I never thought I could have done before. It gave me a hope. It gave me a purpose for my life. It gave me a reason to stop smoking, to stop drinking, and all of the other things that are typical in high school. And, excuse me, I'm having a little bit of trouble with my throat today. I'm sure everybody can identify with that. And my life turned around. I had a new group of friends. I started doing well in school. In fact, many times, even now, people will ask me, you had such a miracle happen in your life when you became a Christian. How can you not be a Christian today? And I have to tell you that just like the children of the Holocaust who were saved by Christians, good Christian people, my coming to God through Christianity did not obligate me to continue to be a Christian once I discovered there was a problem with what I believed in. And in a little while, we'll get into that. But I became a Christian, and my life turned around. All kinds of things changed. So much so that my mother and my sister, who saw my life change, also decided to embrace Christianity. Not long after, my father, who came to visit us, because I was getting serious about a young man, and I had always had this dream that my father would walk me down the aisle when I got married. The unique thing about this is that my father and my mother were divorced when I was 4 years old, and so I hadn't seen my father except one time in about 15 years. But I had this dream that he would walk me down the aisle, and I was getting serious with this young man, and so we invited my dad to come for a visit. And my dad came for a visit, and he fell back in love with my mom. It was really, really cool. He asked my mom if she would marry him, but there was a problem. My mother had become a Christian, and my father wasn't. And if you know any good Christian, what the answer would be was that she couldn't marry my father. But my sister and I, we had an idea. We knew how to solve the problem. We went out and bought ourselves a Bible, and we shared with my father what we believed. And guess what? He became a Christian too. My mom and my dad were remarried, and we were one big, happy Christian family. I married my husband, who was not Jewish, by the way. He was a Christian. And at the time, I didn't think anything of the act of marrying a non-Jew. I certainly didn't see it as intermarriage, because we both believed the same thing. And so we got married, and we made our way to England, where we were stationed because he was in the Air Force. Now, while we were in England, my parents had discovered something here in the United States. They had discovered a group of Jews who believed in Jesus, but chose to continue to call themselves Jews, even though they believed in Jesus. At the same time, some interesting things were happening in my own life. One day, I felt like God was talking to me and told me to light candles on Friday night. Now, where did that come from? I don't know, to be honest with you. I never saw my mother light candles on Friday night. Didn't see my grandparents light candles on Friday night. Perhaps it was from a seed that was planted during my days in Hebrew school. I don't know. But I pulled out the candlesticks that my grandmother had given me, and I pulled out the Maxwell House Haggadah that was in the bottom drawer in my kitchen. Now, why did I have this Maxwell House Haggadah? My family was secular, but we did, in some ways, keep some of the Jewish holidays. In fact, we did do Passover. I'm going to tell you how we did Passover. We would go to my grandparents' house, and my grandfather would pull out the Maxwell House Passover Haggadahs, which were written in an archaic English that I didn't understand. And he would say, everybody turn to page 65. So we'd all open to page 65. He'd read a paragraph to us. We'd sing a chorus of Dayenu, and then we'd sit and we'd eat. Now, we did have matzah at the table, but we also would have bread and fried chicken and stuffing or whatever else was being served. Because my grandmother didn't have the concept of what we do at Passover time. But she knew we ate matzah. So we had matzah at Passover. So I had this Haggadah in my kitchen because I too wanted to preserve this tradition, even though I was a Christian, of having some form of Passover. And I remembered that in the front of the Passover Haggadah, there was the prayer for lighting the candles on Friday night. Why? Because sometimes Passover begins on Friday night, right? So I pulled this out, and I pulled out the candlesticks, and I started lighting candles on Friday night. Lighting candles on Friday night, and I was going to church on Sunday. One day, my husband comes downstairs. Remember, he's a good Christian man. And he says, I've just been reading in my Bible, and you know what? It says in the Bible that there are certain things that God requires the Jewish people to do forever. And if I'm going to be right before God, then I need to make sure that my Jewish wife and my Jewish children continue to do those things. So my husband, who recognized that I was a Jew more than I did, said, that's it, no more pork, no more shellfish in the house. But there went my ham and cheese sandwiches. But one of the things that marked my relationship with God was a willingness and a desire to serve Him in truth. And you'll see a pattern throughout my story that truth is very, very important to me. And if this is what God wanted me to do, then this was what I was going to do. So I was lighting candles on Friday night, I was not eating pork or shellfish, and I was going to church on Sunday. One day, I was reading in the New Testament a passage in the book of 1 Corinthians that talks about women and men covering their heads. Now, it's very confusing in the English, It's hard to understand whether it's saying a woman should cover her head or she shouldn't, or a man should or a man shouldn't. So what we did was we asked our pastor to come to our house and explain this passage to us. It turns out that our pastor was a Greek scholar. I believe he had studied at Oxford University, and we knew that he would give us the answer that we needed to hear. So we asked him to come over, and we said, "Pastor, what does this passage mean?" And he said, "Well, it's difficult to translate, it's difficult to interpret." And I said, "Okay, what does it mean to you? What do you understand the Greek to be saying?" He said, "Well, I think that what the Greek is saying is that a married woman should cover her hair when she's praying. But," he said, "I can't teach that, because women nowadays, they don't want to hear about head coverings." Well, that was no reason for me not to do what I believed that God was calling me to do. So guess what? I started covering my head. Only, I pray all the time. So it couldn't just be a once-in-a-while thing, where I have my scarf over my shoulders, right, and I put it on to say, "Hi, Pat, how you doing?" and take it off again. It wasn't going to work. So I started covering my head all the time. So here's this picture. I'm covering my head. I'm not eating pork or shellfish. I'm lighting candles on Friday night and going to church on Sunday. But what this did was it allowed a conduit to open in my heart to connect me to God and what God wanted in my life. And what it caused was, at the time I didn't know it, but now I look back and I call it my spiritual identity crisis. Because what began to happen was my Jewish soul began to be at war with my Christian beliefs. At the time I didn't know what was going on, I just knew that something uncomfortable was happening. And of course I started to receive a lot of flack from my fellow church members too, especially at Easter time when we wouldn't eat anything that was served. But something was going on. Just about that time, I gave birth to my second child, and my parents came to visit us in England for the birth of our second child. And remember, I told you at the beginning that they had discovered this group of people called themselves Messianic Jews. These were Jewish people who had adopted a belief in Jesus and had somehow found a way to synthesize their Jewish heritage with their Christian beliefs. When I heard of this, I thought this was a very intriguing concept. Perhaps this was the answer to this burden that I was carrying, to this fight that was going on inside of me. So when we came back to the United States, first thing we did was we looked up a Messianic congregation. Now, as has been the case all along, as you heard in my introduction, all the time my husband and I had been serving in the churches that we attended, serving as lay leaders in one form or another, sometimes a little bit more, sometimes a little bit less. And then same thing happened when we joined Messianic congregations. We started going to a Messianic congregation on Saturday and a church on Sunday. For about a year we did this because we weren't sure what we wanted to do. Finally, we got to the point where we said, okay, we can't have 2 Sabbaths every week, so we abandoned the Sunday and we started attending the Messianic congregation. Not long after that, obviously I'm trying to keep this short, but not long after that, my father saw a need for us to start a congregation near where we lived. Also maybe one that was a little bit more Jewish than the one that we were attending. Not that we necessarily knew what that meant, but we knew that it wasn't where we were at. So he invited my husband and myself to join him and my mother to start a Messianic congregation in our community. At the time I thought to myself, well, if we're going to be running something called a Messianic Jewish congregation, I should probably know something about being Jewish. So I started going to the Jewish bookstore and I got out books to read on Judaism. I started with a book by a woman named Luke Greenberg called How to Run a Traditional Jewish Household. Now, one of the interesting things about Blue Greenberg's book, she's a very modern Orthodox woman, and instead of calling herself Orthodox, she really, really likes the phrase Torah observant. And I thought, that's it. That's what we need to be. We need to be Torah observant Messianic Jews. So I continued to go to the Jewish bookstore, and I bought the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch in English, which for those of you who aren't familiar with what that is, it's the condensed code of Jewish law. And I read it through about 3 times. I also started buying books on kashrut and other issues so that we could learn how to have an authentically Torah-observant Messianic congregation. Just an aside, my father came up with the idea at about the same time, so it's questionable who was the first one to make that decision. But be that as it may, we started reading these books. And we didn't start the Torah observant Messianic movement, but up until the time that we started this congregation, it was in its infancy stage. It hadn't gone anywhere. Shortly after we began teaching, it just exploded. So we feel that we were at the forefront of this phenomenon, which now, as you'll hear later on in our talk, has totally taken over this country. And my father started the Association of Torah Observant Messianics, which is now defunct, but at the time it had quite a membership and a readership on his website. His website, by the way, was teshuva.com. Now if you go to teshuva.com, it has a very different taste to it than it did back then. But we were running this congregation, and as you can imagine, sometimes when family members get involved in an endeavor together, sometimes it became a little stressful, and we decided that our relationship with my parents was more important than leading a Messianic congregation, and we chose to leave. At the time, we didn't know where we were going to go because none of the Messianic congregations were observant enough for us. And we figured as long as we were going to be somewhere that wasn't observant, we would hide out someplace where we could just chill out. We probably wouldn't be asked to be in leadership. We probably could just be ourselves for a little while. So we joined the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Jewish they weren't, but they kept Sabbath to some degree, and they were mostly vegetarians, so there was no food issue for us as far as events go and things like that. So by the time they actually accepted our membership, my husband was a deacon, and I was singing in the choir. He was singing in the choir, and we were on the worship team, and we were both already teaching Sunday school and all sorts of things like that. So it wasn't exactly a place to hide out. After about a year and a half, the vice president for global missions of the Seventh-day Adventist Church came to us and he said, "We would like you to start a Messianic congregation for us." Now, part of their motivation was this. They had observed this phenomenon that churches were starting these Hebrew Christian or Messianic congregations, and Jews, at least they thought that they were Jews, were all starting to accept Jesus and join these congregations. Now, never mind the fact that with the exception of about 5 congregations in the country, the vast majority of Messianic congregations have non-Jews as members, not Jews. In our congregation, one of the congregations we attended, out of 250 families, I think there were 5 of us that were Jewish, just to give you an idea. There are some congregations where the percentages are different, but anyway. So the Seventh-day Adventist Church asked us to start a Messianic congregation for them. And not to get into all the details, but we just didn't feel it would work because we didn't feel that we believed the same things that they believed, and we turned them down. About 6 months later, they asked us one more time, and we turned them down again. And then something started to happen. It actually had been happening all along, but it started to rear its ugly head again, what I call my spiritual identity crisis. I think the kicker was when they decided to put a Christmas tree up on the podium for Christmas, and it was just too much for me and my Jewish neshama, my Jewish soul, to handle. So we decided it was time to say goodbye, and we went to a Messianic congregation. Not long after that, we were invited to a family event that was in a different Messianic congregation in Baltimore, Maryland. We were living south of Baltimore, Maryland, and we were attending a congregation in Northern Virginia. If you know the geography, you know that that's all very close and within reason. But we were in Baltimore, and a woman came up to me and said, "I've got this wonderful 5-bedroom house in Upper Park Heights that I would like to sell you." Now, at first moment, I thought, this woman is nuts. Why is she singling me out? And then I realized, well, wait a minute. I'm wearing a long skirt, long sleeves, scarf on my head. What had happened was the woman realized that the perfect family to bring into this Orthodox Jewish community, because Upper Park Heights is the heart of the Orthodox community in Baltimore, would be to bring a Messianic couple that looks like Orthodox Jews. If you had seen us on the street, you would never have thought we were anything but. Not only did I cover my head and wear long sleeves and wear long skirts, but my husband and my boys all wore kippot, and they all wore tzitzit, they all wore fringes, and we looked like Orthodox Jews. We kept kosher, we kept Shabbat pretty close to what we keep now, with a few exceptions. And her idea was, that who better to bring Orthodox Jews to believe in Jesus than Messianic Jews who look like Orthodox Jews. In fact, when she invited us to buy this house, I thought she was nuts, and I knew that how to get rid of it, how to take care of the situation. I decided, since I'm not very good at confrontation, I would ask my husband, I would tell her I needed to ask my husband, because I knew my husband would tell me, "What, are you crazy?" Because the way our relationship works is I'm kind of the kite. I come up with all these visions and ideas and everything, and he's kind of like the anchor that keeps me tethered to this world. So I knew that if I asked him, he would say, "No, that's nuts. We don't live anywhere near Baltimore. I don't work near Baltimore. We're not moving to Baltimore." So I said to her, "Well, I need to speak to my husband." So I went to talk to my husband, and instead of answering as I expected, he said to me, "Well, we can go look at the house." Now, I have it on good authority that that was the first and last time I was ever speechless. But I went back to the woman, and I said to her, "Well, my husband says we can look at it." So we went and we looked at the house. We fell in love with the house. And the only thing left for us to do was what any good Christian couple would do. We went back to our congregation and we asked them what they thought we should do. And of course, unanimously, they felt that we should move into the community because who better to bring Orthodox Jews to Messianic Judaism than Messianic Jews who look like Orthodox Jews. So to make a long story short, we moved to Baltimore. We moved to Park Heights. We encountered a lot of difficulties. When you hear my full version of my story, you can get into the nitty-gritty. But we decided, since we were Torah observant, why break Shabbat to drive to a Messianic congregation when there were dozens of congregations within walking distance for us to attend? So we decided to go to an Orthodox synagogue in the neighborhood. We chose that synagogue because we were familiar with the rabbi that he happened to run a bookstore, the one that I had bought all these books from. And we started going, and immediately we started making friends. They were very warm, they were very welcoming. "Oh, you're homeschooling? Look, we'll introduce you to all these homeschooling families." Now, they had no idea that we were Messianic Jews. And one day my husband, who is a man of tremendous integrity, said, "We have to tell the rabbi. We've got to tell him that we're believers because at some point it's going to come out. And we don't want him to think that we've been purposely deceiving him." Okay? So we invited the rabbi to come to our home, and we didn't tell him why we were inviting him. He did know that my husband wasn't Jewish because unlike some Messianics, my husband, the man of tremendous integrity, when he was offered an aliyah, actually told them he wasn't Jewish. Many, many, many non-Jewish people in the Messianic world will accept an aliyah without letting the rabbi know that they are not halakhically Jewish. However, my husband did not. So you can imagine when we invited the rabbi to come talk to us, what do you think he thought we were inviting him to talk to us about? My husband converting, right? Or maybe about trying to get the kids into school. He had no idea that the reason we had invited him to come over was to tell him that we were believers. So my husband began talking to him and telling him about what he believed. And the rabbi stopped him at some point and said, "You don't believe that anymore, do you?" To which my husband said, "Yeah, I do." Now, in a few seconds, it took for shock to register on the rabbi's face because he had been completely blindsided by this. I began to see my world implode. All of these friends I had made, all of these friends that my children had made, we're on a street that is completely Orthodox, and now we're going to be stuck with this big, beautiful house, and we're going to be totally isolated and maybe even shunned. What was going to happen? So I began crying, and the rabbi asked me, "Well, what do you believe?" And at the time, I just kind of, "Rabbi, please don't kick us out of the shul." Well, thank God, the rabbi fought for a long time. And he looked at me and he said to me the most important thing that anybody said to me along my journey. He said to me, "You are a Jew no matter what you believe, even though what you believe is not Judaism and it's not Jewish." Okay? He said, "You and the children are welcome to continue coming to the synagogue, but your husband," they didn't know what to do with him. So they decided, he said, "Not for right now, no." He said, "But there's one catch." He said, "You have to talk to this guy from an organization called Jews for Judaism." Now, I reluctantly agreed. I liken it to when you buy a piece of software and you put it in your computer and it comes up with this window that says you agree to the terms of the software, right? And you look at it and you think, I'm not going to read through all of this because I'm going to agree whether I really agree or not. It doesn't matter what it says inside, because otherwise I wouldn't have spent the $250 for this piece of software, right? And if I say no, it's not going to let me install it. So what would be the point? So we click it anyway, thinking, they'll never come after me, right? So in the same way, I agreed to talk to this guy from Jews for Judaism. Now, the man who came over is the former director of the Baltimore office. His name is Mark Powers. And he came to my house and he came in and he said, let's talk about why you think Jesus is the Jewish Messiah. My husband brought up a point. He said, well, let's take a look at that. And he opened up the Bible and he showed us how this one verse, which was a very, very core verse to our beliefs, was based on a mistranslation and had been taken out of context. The talk was not very long at all. Maybe he spent an hour in our house, but he left, leaving me with an awful lot to chew on. Over the course of the next few weeks, I went back to his office with questions upon questions upon questions. And he showed me, one by one, how all of these proofs for Jesus' messiahship were based on lies, taken out of context, or in some cases, even fabricated completely. Well, like the title of my story, How Many Bricks Does It Take? One by one, the bricks were being pulled out of the foundation of my faith. There was nothing left for it to stand on. And that's when I realized that I could no longer be a Christian. And that's when I came back to Judaism. Now, the rest of the story is kind of obvious, I think. I did a lot of studying. I started volunteering for Jews for Judaism. I became active in counter-missionary work in the community. My children all came along with me, which I know is a question you all probably will ask towards the end. And 3 years ago, my husband converted to Judaism, and we were married in the Etz Chaim Center in Baltimore. My parents also came back to Judaism as a result of that, and they're sitting here today, Mom and Dad. And now I am very, very, very happy to be part of the work. I mean, I wish, in fact, the greeting that I greeted my colleagues with just before Rosh Hashanah is that this should be the year that Mashiach comes back and puts us all out of work. Comes back, comes, and puts us all out of work. But there's so much to be done here. You like that? Is that a good one? And it's being taped. This is for posterity, folks. But there's a lot of work to be done here. I'll get into that a little bit later when we talk about our third part of our speech, of our talk tonight, and about the observations that I've made. But I'm very thankful. I owe my life, literally, to Jews for Judaism, and for sending me someone to talk to me about why what I believed could not possibly be true. Stuff that I had never seen or heard of, even though I had studied evangelism. I had studied the Christian Bible and the Hebrew Bible from top to bottom, inside and out for 17 years. But my eyes had never seen the truth. And so now I'm very, very privileged to be working with Jews for Judaism in bringing the truth to our Jewish brothers and sisters. And I'm hoping that as we expand, we will reach out not just to the Anglo community, but to the Israeli community, the Russian community, and every other community within the Israeli society. Thank you for the word. All right. So for now, I'm going to end my talk, and we will take questions and answers later. So thank you very much.
It looked a lot easier to hold this than bending onto the podium. Penina, thank you so much for that inspirational, scary, and yet somehow very humorous story. It gives me great pleasure, ladies and gentlemen, to present to you Rabbi Ben-Zion Kravitz, an acknowledged authority on Judaism and Christian polemics. Rabbi Kravitz is the founder of Jews for Judaism International and is the executive director of the Los Angeles branch of Jews for Judaism. A renowned lecturer, Rabbi Kravitz has lectured extensively throughout the United States, the former Soviet Union, South Africa, Australia, Canada, the United Kingdom, and of course here in Israel. His programs have been enthusiastically received by all denominations of Judaism. Rabbi Kravitz is the author of the highly acclaimed booklet, The Jewish Response to Missionaries. There are currently over more than 320,000 copies of the booklet in print in 7 languages. Rabbi Kravitz is also a chaplain and advanced critical incident counselor for the Los Angeles Police Department. His hobbies include skiing, scuba diving, and martial arts. Speaking tonight on the power of persuasion, please help me welcome Rabbi Ben-Sion Kravitz.
As I look out over the crowd, I'm really moved by the turnout. I want to personally welcome every single one of you, especially the people that I haven't seen in a long time, people that have been part of my life, people that have come up to me and say thank you for helping change their life. So I'm really happy to be here, and also especially want to introduce and thank my wife Devorah, who's here with me, sitting in the back. I can tell you that without her, none of the things that I've been able to accomplish with Jews for Judaism would have happened. We decided this evening that we expand and give you an additional taste of some of the things that Jews for Judaism does. I'm sure you can all agree that when all of our offices joined together and we decided to appoint Penina as the director for Jews for Judaism here in Israel, that we could not have found a more experienced candidate who really knows the ins and outs and has a passion and a heart to talk to people about godliness. It's very meaningful. And you will hear over the course of this evening, but as you come to more events, issues that deal with the theological differences between Judaism and Christianity, about Messianic Judaism, where does that really stand? But there are other issues that we deal with that are equally important, because sometimes we're accused of being anti-Christian, which is kind of strange because in Southern California, I have had Christian families call me up and say, can you help our child who has become so extreme, so radical, even in their evangelical church? Perhaps some of the techniques that you use in helping a person use their critical thinking skills might even help them. So there's an issue that's theological, and there's also an issue that's psychological that deals with critical thinking. So one of the programs that Rabbi Michael Skobak and our Toronto office and I have worked to put together is called The Power of Persuasion, which really deals with the challenges of critical thinking. And the subtitle, if you've noticed it, is What Do Cults, Telemarketers, and Terrorists Have in Common? And this is a really hot topic now, especially in the United States. I just did a tour in the Chicago area at Northwestern University. Over 300 people came out to hear this presentation. So I'm going to try to do it in the abridged version because we're trying to cover a lot this evening. You know that there have been many cults over the history of many of us, the last 30, 40 years. And some of them have caused groups of people, normal people, to do some of the most amazing things in the name of God, in the name of their religion. And part of the question that I'm trying to get you to think about is, what would cause a person to do such strange things? Many of you may remember a group called the Unification Church, also known as the Moonies. Now the Moonies had people standing on street corners selling flowers for 20 hours a day. But how was Reverend Moon, a minister from South Korea, who claimed to be the Messiah, able to gather 1,500 people in Madison Square Garden in 1998 and match up these 1,500 people within a matter of an hour, people that had never met each other, and perform a mass marriage? And they were willing to do it. What power of persuasion did he have to compel these people to just follow his instructions? Another example was the Branch Davidian cult. This took place primarily in San Antonio, Texas. David Koresh, who chose that name after King David, and Koresh, Cyrus, king of Persia, claiming to be an incarnation of both of them. He had many members in his compound. There was accusations of child abuse, arms weapons being there, and the ATF prepared to go in and to rescue these children, and he set the compound on fire, and 131 people were killed. What possessed them to give over their life for him? In 1978, a minister in San Francisco had his picture taken with the mayor of San Francisco because of the good work he was doing in helping homeless people get food. Then Jim Jones moved his Jonestown group to Guyana. And when Senator Ryan came there looking for his daughter, who had joined this cult, and was murdered by cult members, and he realized that the end was coming, he convinced his members to go to a higher place. They all drank, knowingly, poisoned Kool-Aid, and 911 men, women, and children committed mass murder. What possesses people to do that? Now, in dealing with the police department and being a trained critical incident counselor, crisis counselor, I've had the privilege of helping many police officers, being in many crises that, unfortunately, many of you may know from having read it on the internet, that a few years I was here with my wife. We saw a horrible car accident. I'm sure you know that's a problem here in Israel with car accidents. And a young girl from Jerusalem was near Tel Aviv, and we saw her hit by a car. She was thrown over the car, and she stopped breathing, and her heart stopped. And because of the training I had with the police department, I was able to do CPR, and we brought her back to life. And thank God she's well and fine. But part of what I do is dealing with potential terrorist attacks and how to counsel people that go through that. I was at the El Al incident in Los Angeles where there was a shooting at the El Al desk. So we learn about terrorist attacks in the police department that there's three major threats. They're called NBC, nuclear, biological, and chemical. You may be surprised to hear that the first chemical attack, domestic terrorist attack, was done by a cult, a religious cult. It was done by a cult in 1995 in Japan called Om Shirinkyo, where they released sarin nerve gas in the subway stations. 19 people died, but more than that, 5,500 people were hospitalized and put into critical condition. So that's the first example of a religious cult resorting to terrorism. In 1985, another group that was up in Oregon, led by a cult leader from India named Rajneesh, he had so much power that his followers gave him 95 Rolls Royces. He had an influence over them, a power of persuasion. He had opposition from the community. He convinced his followers to grow salmonella poisoning and to go into the restaurants and sprinkle it on the salad bars. 751 people were poisoned. We see that this goes from cult groups to terrorist groups. You look at a picture like this young man. I'm sure many of you know who he is, maybe you don't. This is John Walker Lynn, who was raised in Marin County, California, to an affluent family. Father's an attorney. How did he end up being the first American found in Afghanistan when they went in to stop the Taliban? He had been brainwashed by them. How does a young person like that be persuaded so powerfully? The young man who grew up in Egypt. Father was an architect. He was studying to be an architect at the University of Cairo. Most experts say that he did not grow up thinking that he wanted to fly an airplane into a building. So when Muhammad Atta first got into it, he wasn't thinking, I'll go and just join this group and become a terrorist. He was brainwashed by these groups. As we know that the Hamas brainwashes children from a very young age to be suicide bombers. They use Mickey Mouse, someone dressed up as Mickey Mouse, to brainwash these kids. So we know that this power of persuasion can have actual consequences that are extremely dangerous. And the experts in dealing with the power of persuasion, really, in dealing with cults and terrorists, call it thought reform. And it was originally explored by a number of psychologists and psychiatrists at universities like UCLA, UC Berkeley, and Harvard, because there were soldiers who were coming back from the Korean War who had been brainwashed while they were prisoners of war. And they wanted to understand what's going on here, what's being done to them. It was something very new. So these professors did research on this, and they realized there is a process of brainwashing or thought reform which involves psychological and environmental manipulation, change of diet, hypnosis, deprivation of sleep, programming fears and phobias into people. And in fact, the Moonies were the classic example of adapting these procedures that were done in Korea, in North Korea. They would take people in buses, the lights were on so they couldn't see where they were going. They would deprive them of sleep. They'd change their diet so there was no protein. They would have them chant songs that were meaningless over and over again and make them fall into this. They would tell them that anyone outside of the group was Satan. And all these phobias added up to actually, in a very short period of time, being able to brainwash many young, bright college students. Now, to move on a little bit, how does that have to do with marketing? I want to try to bring to you the idea that we are all being manipulated. Maybe not to the extreme of these groups, and not necessarily with an evil intent, but we are in some way being manipulated, and we may not be aware of it. Do you know that in the United States, and I'm sure it's true here in Eretz Yisrael, that the average person between television and the internet watches 30 hours of entertainment a week? That means that they probably are going to see 39,000 commercials a year. So in America, the thing that became very popular and famous because of that was something called TiVo. It allows people to record their shows and skip over the commercials. Sounds like a great idea, but not to the advertisers. They didn't like that. So they started using something called placement advertising, product placement, where they would put the product in the show, so you really weren't aware that you were being marketed to. The classic example, one of the most popular television shows in America today among young people, is a show called 24. It's about a counter-terrorist unit that's fighting off a terrorist attack, and they've got 24 hours to solve this. So the whole season is about a 24-hour period. Last season, the first show, they start off by meeting in the counter-terrorist headquarters by the U.S. government. Every computer in that headquarters was an Apple computer. You know how I knew? Because it had that little Apple logo on the back of every monitor. 1 hour later, in the next show, which is only 1 hour later, amazingly, every single one of the monitors became Dell. Now, I know that our government knows how to waste money. There is no question they know how to. But I don't think in the middle of a major terrorist attack that they're going to go say, you know what, I think we'll get rid of the Macs and we'll put in Dell, because it's a good idea. It's all placement advertising, subliminally selling you these products without knowing it. And we fall for it because there's something in psychology, and there are social psychologists that actually study this to learn how to manipulate people to buy things. And in this social psychology, they realize that there is something called autopilot. We know that planes can be put onto autopilot and go automatically, and you can kind of take it for granted what's going on. But they learned that from the animal kingdom. In the same way that certain animals can communicate. Like, I always remember as a kid watching the pictures in the biology book of bees, honeybees, that they would move around in a dance to tell the other bees where the honey is located. I never figured that out. But in fact, they found that there is a certain fish called the grouper fish that will eat almost anything. Very large fish will eat anything, and because he eats everything, he's got a real dental problem. Teeth are full of decaying flesh. So how do they work? Fish have a symbiotic relationship. There's a fish called the plenty. This is the grouper, pretty ugly. Okay? The bottom is is the grouper with a plenty fish inside his mouth. And he goes in there and he cleans out the stuff. And it's a good relationship. The problem is, what stops the grouper from eating the plenty fish? So the plenty fish decided, over centuries, to do a dance. It does a dance similar to the bees. And when the grouper sees that, he opens his mouth and says, for you, I'll open my mouth and help me out, and I won't eat you. So this plenty fish, which is on the bottom, looks exactly like this cleaner wrasse. The other fish realized if it would do the same dance, it could trick the grouper. So it imitates the dance. The grouper sees the dance, sees that they look alike, opens its mouth, but the other fish goes in, instead of cleaning the teeth, it starts eating the grouper from the inside out. It's a bizarre thing. But why does the grouper continue to do this? Because it's on autopilot. Because it's so used to this dance, and this fish meaning something beneficial, so it doesn't know how to deal with being tricked. We are all put on autopilot. I'm going to give you an example. I'm going to show you a sign. I want you to read it. I don't want anyone to read it out loud. I want you to read it to yourself and in your mind. Okay? It won't take more than a few seconds for you to figure out what this sign says. If anyone says it out loud, you're going to ruin the effect of this. So I'm going to hold up the sign for a few seconds. Everybody read the sign to yourself. Okay, I'm going to move it around from one side of the room to the other. By now, I'm hoping that those of you that speak English or remember English will be able to read this sign. Everybody done? Yeah. Okay. I want everybody to watch and look around the room and watch what happens. How many of you read that sign says, "Please keep off the grass"? Raise your hand. Now everybody look at how many hands went up. Now put your hands down. How many people did not read, "Please keep off the grass"? Now we've got more people saying it did. So the people who read it, "Please keep off the grass," are shaking their heads and laughing, saying, "What is everybody, on LSD or something? What's going on here?" Let's look at it again. What does it really say? It says, "Please keep off the grass." But why did those people read, "Please keep off the grass"? Because you're on autopilot. You're so used to it. So this is another form of how marketing people get you to buy things. They do it in psychological tests. If 4 people stand outside and look up in the sky, they say, "Isn't that the most amazing, beautiful red balloon in the sky?" Someone else will come by and look up and say, "Yeah, but there's no balloon." Because there's a mob mentality. People go with the crowd. At one university, the professor had 600 students in his class. And he had one day when only one student was missing. So he told them, "If you all want to pass this class, this is what you have to do. The next time that young man who's missing comes in, I'm going to draw 2 lines on the board. One is going to be 3 feet long, and the other one is going to be 1 foot long. And when I go around the room, I'm going to ask every single person if they're the same size, and I want all of you to say yes." And the day came when that student was there, and he did that experiment, and 599 students said they're the same size. And this student was asked last. Guess what he said? Same size, even though he knew they weren't. Why? He was on autopilot. This happens with not only with autopilot like that, it can happen even with the way you talk to people. For example, they found in an experiment that if out of 100 people, if 10 or 12 people are in line at a university library, and they are waiting to make a photocopy, and someone goes to the front of the line and says, "Excuse me, can I get in front of you?" Only 60% will say yes, 40% will say no. But if in the same experiment, that person goes to the front and he says, "Excuse me, can I get in front of you to make a copy because I have an emergency?" 94% will say yes. Obviously, it makes sense. But you know what's really amazing? If you go up to the front of the line and you say, "Can I get in front of you to make a photocopy because I need to make a photocopy?" 93% will say yes. Because you're on autopilot. The minute you hear that word "because," it means there has to be a reason. So these are some examples. I'm not going to go into all of them because we're really trying to go into an abridged version of the lecture. But I want to show you one more powerful example. And this is a famous logo. Is everybody familiar with this company? FedEx. Now you may not be aware, and if anybody does graphic design, they had to hire a graphic designer to come up with this logo. They came to the CEO and they said, "What are you looking for?" He said, "We're looking for a logo that will indicate that we have the ability to get your product to wherever you want it quickly." So they went out, they came back with the design, and they said, "This is it," and it was only $100,000. So the owner looked at it and he said, "Get out of my office. I'm not paying $100,000 for, our name in 2 colors. What are you, crazy?" So they said, "Keep looking at it." So as the CEO kept looking at it, after about 30 seconds, he started jumping up and down. He says, "I can't believe what I'm seeing." there is an embedded message in this logo that your mind sees even though you may not see it right away. There is an arrow being shot at an X, like an archer shooting an arrow at an X saying, we will shoot your package to the target and get it there. Who does not see the arrow? How many people do see it? So some of you see it. Keep looking and watch this. If you look at the white space between the E and the X, I'm going to turn it this way, it's pointing up, you will see a white arrow. Everybody see it here? I'm blocking it with my hand so it's easy to see. Pointing up. That's an embedded message. I guarantee you, you will never look at a FedEx truck the same. Not only that, when you see a FedEx truck, whoever's sitting next to you, you're going to say, Tira, Macarafo! You're going to go crazy. Just keep your hands on the wheel, okay? Because this is amazing. That's an embedded message. You can do all kinds of embedded messages. We have a very famous symbol. Everybody here is familiar with this symbol. It means something very much to you. It's made up of two horizontal lines and a star in the middle. Could it be coincidence that when a certain group made their logo, they made their words into two horizontal lines with a star in the middle because they wanted to embed a message that was similar to this Jewishness of an Israeli flag, blue and white? Could be. Now, this type of manipulation can be used for good and bad. They can use hypnosis, they can claim ESP. In my longer presentation, I actually read people's minds in the audience. I don't know how much time I have left. I think I'm running out.
You want to do a sample?
I can do one sample. Okay, I'm going to do one sample. Okay, here's an envelope. I don't know how many are young enough to remember the Johnny Carson show. But Johnny used to go like this and then read the envelope. I'm going to see if I can get 30% of you to know what's inside this envelope. Okay? That'd be pretty good if I can get 30% of you to know what's inside this envelope. Okay, here's the envelope. It's closed. Now, as I'm putting it to my head and I'm throwing out the thoughts, I want you to do the following. And this is also something you have to do inside your head. Do not say your answers out loud. Okay? Because you'll confuse other people. It's a little bit of math, because you know that math is the foundation of letters. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to pick any number between 1 and 10. Not a 1, not a 10. Any one of the numbers in between. Once you have that number, I simply want you to multiply it by the number 9. Once you've multiplied it by 9, I want you to think if it has 1 or 2 digits. If it has 2 digits, I want you to add the 2 digits together. So if you had 12, add the 1 and the 2 to get 3. So whatever number you have now, you're back probably to a 1-digit number. And I want you to subtract 5 from it. Once you subtract 5 from that number, you have another number. Whatever that number is, I want you, wait a second. I want you to count in the ABCs what letter that number corresponds to. So if it was the letter 1, it's an A. B is a 2. Figure out what letter. Once you get that letter, and we're almost done, because it's just in here and we're throwing the thought out. I want you to pick a country that begins with that letter. Once you have a country that begins with that letter, think of the second letter in that country, because we're all talking about letters here, and think of a 4-legged animal that begins with that letter. And once you have that animal, think of its most common color. Okay? So I want everybody to think of a color, a country, an animal, and its common color. Ready? 1, 2, 3. I want to know, by raise of hand, how many of you are thinking of a gray elephant from Denmark? Okay? I see some people going, how did he do that? That's the next class for Jews for Judaism. Who's saying, oh my God, it's amazing. How did I do it? So, the point I want to make, I can tell you later during the question and answers perhaps how I did it. But here's the more important point. A magician or stage comedian would use that as a way of entertaining you. A manipulative person might use it to convince you that they have supernatural powers. They might do something like that. They might be able to cause a physical reaction in your body that they tell you they have the power to do. I was helping a individual who was in a cult, and she was convinced that they had removed an evil spirit from her. And I was able to actually demonstrate how I could cause a physical sensation of removing something from her body. And all I did is I told her to squeeze her hand as hard as possible and then put her other hand across her wrist. What I was actually doing is having her force the blood out of her hand by squeezing, holding it back by putting her hand across the wrist, and then her hand was white, but she didn't notice it. And when she let go, all the blood rushed back into her hand. So she felt the sensation. But a manipulative person, a person who wants to control someone, can use these techniques to convince a person that they have supernatural powers, that they have a spiritual power from heaven. Now, if they're using it for good or entertainment, that's fine. But people who use it to control people, to manipulate people, to get them to do evil things, that's where we get the movements of cults. We know from studies that terrorist groups have studied. Where did they get their manuals? They studied, in terms of brainwashing, these cult brainwashing techniques. And they use it in their recruitment and in their phobias to keep people into the groups. So there is this connection of persuasion that goes everywhere. Sometimes we're persuaded by people that are selling Coca-Cola or cigarettes. And they put an ad up in America for cigarettes. On the bottom there's a little picture and it says, warning, Surgeon General warning, smoking this product will kill you. It'll give you emphysema. Now what picture they put up on the billboard? They don't put an old person in a wheelchair with an oxygen mask. They give a healthy cowboy riding off into the sunset in Wyoming. We have a cowboy here, right? He's riding off into the sunset because they want you to disassociate. So this is what cults do. And unfortunately, this is what has happened with not only cults, but with the Messianic movement. And I'll end with this. When Jews for Jesus, for example, makes a flyer that looks like this one, that says Jews should not believe in Jesus, using the word Jews in the center of a star, what does that remind you of? It reminds you of the Holocaust. It's not an accident. And when it says Jews should not believe in Jesus, because they want you to pick up the literature. If it said Jews should believe in Jesus and have a cross, up on their, front porch, you're not going to pick up the literature by making it look Jewish. By mistranslating and taking out of context dozens of Bible passages and passages from the Talmud, passages from the Kabbalah. I'll never forget when I challenged the Messianics once. I said, I will give you $100,000 if you can show me where the quote is in the Zohar that you have in your pamphlet that says that the reason God's name is 3 times in the Shema, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, because it represents God the Father, God the Son, and God of the Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit. And I said, I'll give you $100,000 if you find that in the Zohar, because it doesn't exist. And I guarantee you 99% of the Messianic Jews have accepted and believed that and never looked for it and don't realize that it doesn't exist and it was a total fabrication. People are being manipulated. And the purpose of our organization and the purpose of having Nina here in Yerushalayim and in all of Israel, and having the help of many of you, because I hope that many of you will come forward and not only volunteer your time, but help us. And this was not meant, she won't make an appeal, but I will tell you, I came here primarily to speak and to meet with some other people to help get the funding to make this a reality. And we hope that any of you that are in a position to help us will. But that's all we're going to say about that. But more so, we need to help the Jews out there. We need to be the one that tells them, this is our faith, this is our religion, this is our diamond. And although a diamond, when you take it out of the ground, may not look so beautiful, because it needs to be polished and cleaned up, it takes a little bit of work and we can make it shine. And together, that's what Jews for Judaism has been doing for over 25 years. All of us that have been involved over this period, we've worked to save people. And that's what we're dedicated to. We've given up many other things in our life to do that. And we're very happy that we're launching this. And I'm very, very honored and happy that Nina is part of this. Thank you.
We're going to take questions. We have one more part. Morphs into the word Jesus from a distance on that graphic. That's it.
Thank you. For the ladies and gentlemen, please, for the last talk this evening, we're going to actually hear from both sides tonight. We're going to hear from Rabbi Kravitz and Benina. We're going to discuss really the current and the local issue, the issues surrounding us in Yerushalayim and in Israel, and just they're going to just give us a little bit of background information regarding what is actually happening over here. So please, for the last time tonight, Rabbi Kravitz and Benina.
I would just like to say one thing, because I know that in some places where I speak, people do get offended by us mentioning the name of Jesus. But I want to tell you, when I was in South Africa the second time for my lecture tour, my last speech after about 20 of them was before all of the Orthodox rabbis of the community. And it's a custom to say a milsa de vedichasa, which is kind of a lighthearted kind of Dvar Torah that livens people up. So I told them the following thing, that when people ask about saying the name of Jesus, where are you allowed to say it or not? So actually, if you look in Shulchan Aruch in Hilchos Avodah Zarah, in the laws of idolatry, where it talks about mentioning the names of other gods, in the Bir HaGra, the Vilna Gaon, he says the following. He says, Mutu loyma shem shal oz tov haish. It is permissible to say the name of the guy whose name I won't mention. But it is permissible, but he preferred not to. So I said to the rabbis, I don't know what's more funny, that the Vilna Gaon said that you could say the name of this guy, but he wouldn't say it, or a Chabad guy's up here quoting the Vilna Gaon. So everybody got a good laugh out of that. So I must tell you that if I saying it I offended anyone, it's only for the purpose of education. It is not for the purpose of worship in any way. Okay? So now I'm going to turn it over to Penny. I'm going to start. Okay. I'm glad you know what I was supposed to talk about. Jews for Judaism recognized a changing trend in proselytizing. 2 years ago, with the funding of the Los Angeles Jewish Community Foundation, we received a very large grant to do a strategic plan. It took a lot of time, but the first step in a strategic plan is research. You need to see what the trends are, what's going on out there. And we started noticing that a lot of people thought the missionary problem had disappeared, primarily because they didn't see missionaries standing on street corners wearing Jews for Jesus t-shirts, handing out flyers. So they said they must have gone away. But what we knew wasn't true, because we were the ones getting dozens of phone calls every month, or even more. We knew it wasn't. So what was happening? So when we started doing our research, we realized a couple of different things happened. Evangelical Christians, many of them, were training young college and high school students in something called peer proselytizing, or friendship proselytizing, where they would train these young people to go to their friends and talk to them. And they were also adapting the model of the Messianic Jews for Jesus groups and telling them they could be Jewish and Christian simultaneously. So it was much more going on behind the scenes. That's why people weren't seeing it. In the same way that the Moonies don't stand on the street corners handing out flowers, selling flowers, but they bought the Washington Times and they own that newspaper. And that's how they get their message out. And they have conferences because of the influence of owning that newspaper. They've changed their model. The same way advertisers change their model from when they can't have commercials anymore because people get rid of them with this machine called TiVo, so they do placement advertising. So things have changed. We started seeing that the phenomenon of how proselytizing is changing is not only happening in America, but all over the world. We also saw it here in Eretz Yisrael. We knew from Jews for Judaism, there's lots of proselytizing going on. We're getting the phone calls. We're getting the emails. I cannot tell you how many emails I get from Israeli families telling me it's happened to a relative of theirs. So why are we have so many people say it doesn't exist? It doesn't exist. Well, primarily because there are many evangelical Christians who are true friends of Israel, who are helping us financially and politically. Some of them have no hidden agenda. They're very clear about what they want to do and help Israel. Some do have a hidden agenda. You can never really know. But I can tell you, when the battle for Gush Katif was going on, and someone came to our synagogue in LA to raise money, and I can proudly say that our synagogue gave over $18,000. I can tell you that the person that came from Gush Katif told us, and he said, Rabbi, just heard what you do. I have to tell you, a group of Christians came to Gush Katif to give our support, and they had Israeli security guards protecting them. And one of the security guards came up to me and he said, Tagid li mazal tov. Lama? Hayom yom holedet sheli. Today is my birthday. So he said, Ben kama ata? How old are you? He said, Ani ben shalosh. I'm 3. He looked at him, what do you mean? Yes, I'm 3 because I was born again 3 years ago. This is an Israeli. So, I don't care if it's 1 Jew or 1,000,000 that we lose, it doesn't matter. And if it's your child, it won't matter either. So Jews for Judaism's foundational belief has always been, the statement in the Talmud Sanhedrin, whoever saves a single life is as if they saved an entire world. But the Talmud continues, whoever destroys a single life is as if they destroyed an entire world. The loss of even 1 Jew to our Jewish heritage and to our faith is too much for us. And that's why we are dedicated, and that's why we needed to do something different and use the proven techniques that Jews for Judaism has across the world and our unique approach to bring it here and to try to help out in the best way that we can to spread our message and to keep Jews Jewish.
Okay, I'm going to try my hand at a joke. I'm not good at telling jokes. I'm going to warn you ahead of time. If you found something that I said funny, it was an accident. I didn't do it on purpose. So a rabbi, a Knesset member, and a missionary walk into a room. Sounds like a joke, doesn't it? Well, it's not. It's happening in Israel now, and it's not funny. In fact, it's downright scary. I'm going to give you some excerpts from a talk that I gave when I was in Baltimore called Enemy Mine. I chose the title just very briefly from a movie that had to do with an earthling and an other planet-ing, I don't know what you would call them.
Alien.
An alien, thank you. An earthling and an alien who are enemies, and they find themselves on this third planet, and the people of that third planet are their enemies, and they have to work together in order to survive so that they can each go home and one day probably kill each other. But according to the write-up on the movie, it's a beautiful concept, and there's somebody who thinks that it is, and I don't agree with him. About a year ago, a man named Michael Steinhardt wrote an article which was published in the Jerusalem Post online edition. Michael Steinhardt, for those of you who don't know, is the co-founder of Birthright International. And he wrote an article entitled, "We Desperately Need Friends." And in the article, he goes through and basically totally rails against people like us who say, well, as he put it, in the end, we have even become suspicious of evangelical support for Israel, in the belief that they have a hidden religious agenda, and he's so surprised that intelligent people would have a problem with this. How can we treat our friends this way? He says that if this isn't friendship, we would have a hard time defining what is. Are we to refuse these acts of loving kindness from evangelicals merely because we disagree with their religious beliefs? What would that say about us as a people? Now, in a way, what he said is right, and what Rabbi Kravitz said is right, although I would disagree with him on probably percentages. But there are some Christian evangelical organizations whose main purpose is simply to help Jews in Israel, to help Jews get to Israel. However, unfortunately, maybe I've become jaded, my opinion is that they are few and far between. And what's worse is there's a whole group of evangelical organizations out there, organizations that we can't pin anything on, organizations who do not put anything in their literature about evangelizing Jews, although if you read it and you know what you're looking for, you know that they promote it. However, organizations like, for example, and I'm going to name one, the International Christian Embassy in Jerusalem, who does absolutely nothing in their literature to promote the evangelizing of Jewish people in Israel, yet brings over hundreds and hundreds of evangelical volunteers every year who come here, and what do while they are here? They evangelize. If you don't believe me, I can show you. I have email after email after email of people who are not just evangelized by these tourists who they caught at a restaurant or on a bus, but by the permanent workers who are here, who are in their old ponds learning the language, I was in an Ulpan. There were 27 students in this Ulpan. Of the 27 students, 3 of them were outward, obvious Christian missionaries, okay? Who knows how many others might have been in there who were keeping their mouths shut. But 3 of them, that's more than 10%. Other people I know say that more than half of their Ulpan class was filled with missionaries. Anyway, one of the problems is that we are bringing people into the community who are befriending us, they're learning the language, and they are missionizing us on this friendship level. But we also have another problem. And that is revealed in an article which was in the April-May 2006 edition of the Messianic Times. Messianic Times is a Hebrew Christian newspaper. And the article was entitled, get this, UMJC strikes up dialogue with Knesset. Leaders get the ear of the MKs on religious freedom. Okay, the article was written by Leo Holman and Rebecca Colfer. I'm going to spare you all of the details. But the point of the article is that because of these other groups who do have a hidden agenda, not the ones, the few, who are saying, you know, we love Israel, we're giving to Israel because we support Israel. But these other ones have an agenda, and especially the Hebrew Christian organizations such as the UMJC and the MJAA. The agenda is, and they've said it themselves, in order to get equal rights for Aliyah, for Messianic Jews, to get a political presence within the Knesset so that they can change the laws. Now, one of the things that Rabbi Kravitz said was that so many people don't think that there's a problem in Israel. One of the biggest things that I get is people saying to me, but isn't it illegal to proselytize in Israel? Now, I'm curious, how many of you here thought, before you spoke to me, that it was illegal to proselytize in Israel? Okay, not quite half. You would not believe how many people think that. And when I tell them that it has been legal to proselytize in Israel for over 25 years, they're shocked. Anti-missionary legislation was down sometime in the early 80s, I believe 1982. And every time that it has been attempted, there has been an attempt to bring it back. The evangelical Christian groups that support our country have exercised their political power and managed to get those who are in the government to keep us from passing these laws. It is only illegal to proselytize in this country if you're doing it with enticement. In other words, a bribe. They do it anyway. I had a volunteer who went to Bridges for Peace, for example. It's also illegal to proselytize minors, yes. That is for an adult to proselytize minor. Someone said the army, however, I would like to read something to you. Something that I think you will find scary. This was from an organization called Tents of Mercy, which operates here in Israel. They have a newsletter called Oasis. This is from a year ago. And one of their leaders writes, one of my children is an 18-year-old combat soldier in the Israeli Defense Forces, IDF. He came home on leave with the following story. During a long night of guard duty, he and another soldier got into a philosophical discussion about God, creation, and the Messiah. They teased each other back and forth about evolution versus creation. But when my son spoke clearly of his faith in Yeshua, his companion asked, "Tell me about this Yeshua again?" In the end, his friend said, "Hey, I want to follow your Yeshua. Make me a Messianic too." Had we not arrived in Israel some 14 years ago, enabling Avi to grow up here, knowing Hebrew as if it were his native language, the above conversation would never have happened. The generation of our children, those who have attended school in Israel and become part of the fabric of society, they are the harvest workers who will bring this nation to God in unprecedented numbers. Now, if that isn't scary in and of itself, I don't know what is. Yes, please.
I just want to interject one point. Even for those of you that may think we're perhaps overly harsh toward the evangelical church and Christians who are helpful to Israel, I can understand where you're coming from. But let's put them even aside. You have a Jews for Jesus Center with 8 families, many of whom, the majority of whom are Israelis who converted to Christianity, who are working here. You have Chosen People Ministries with a 3,500 square foot building here in Jerusalem, a Messianic center. You have the Messianic Jewish Alliance of America, and if you look on the cover of our newsletter from Toronto, it is shocking to see that in the parade, the Jerusalem Day Parade, they not only marched in the parade, which I could understand and realize to be all-inclusive, but to have them lead the parade. And when you watch the video and you see the Israelis waving to them and being totally unaware of that these people have an agenda to share their belief in Jesus in the name, calling him Yeshua, it's mind-boggling. These are just the tips of an iceberg. So we are basing our opinion about the seriousness on years of research. We delve beyond the surface. We see beyond the tip of the iceberg and know what's going on. And we have a growing problem in the fact that there is this dichotomy in Israeli society of people who are very committed to Judaism and Jewish values and spirituality, and a large percentage that don't feel that that's an important issue at all. And part of Jews for Judaism isn't simply dissuading people from being Christian or a Mooney, but to inspire people to be excited about their Judaism. And I'm sure there are people in this room that could raise their hand and say they were touched in some way by the work that we did. Even I know that there's, if you don't mind, there's a couple here whose son was a famous singer, got involved in Christianity. We helped him, and through him, his whole family got involved in Judaism. You want to raise your hands? Right here. My friends Judy, but it's about getting people to feel that spark of Judaism, it's not about simply keeping Jews away from missionaries, but it's inspiring them. So that's part of our mission, to inspire people. So that, you can't deny, is important in Israel. So wherever you fall in the spectrum of concern over this, there's a need and there's a purpose for us, and we definitely are going to move forward. I just had to throw that in.
Thank you, Rabbi Kravitz. All right. So one of the things that I think I've been asked a lot of times, so what's the problem? Why is it an issue? So what? When we were at the Sukkot parade handing out literature, and we went there, by the way, we created two pieces of literature, one which we translated into Hebrew. The first piece of literature that we created was called Look Before You Leap. In Hebrew, it's Think Before You Jump. But what it basically said was, you are a Jew, and you have a very precious faith. When you are looking for a spiritual connection, and that's something very important to understand, is that Jewish people who convert to Judaism, to some form of Christianity, they're spiritual people. They're not crazy people. A lot of Jews think that these are people who really have something wrong with them, and that's why they go off. I'll tell you that 99% of the Jewish people who convert don't convert because they're convinced of a proof, but because of somebody they meet or something they see. But ultimately, these are spiritual people who are looking for a spiritual connection. And for whatever reason, they didn't realize that they could have this connection within Judaism. It may be because of the form of Judaism they were shown. It may be for, a number of different reasons. But what happens is when they are looking for a spiritual connection, they discover these people who know how to be kind, who are joyful, who really love God and really enjoy worshiping God. And the leaflet that I wrote said, look to your faith first before looking outside your faith. Because what a shame it would be for you to spend your entire life looking for something you had all along. Now, one of the things that we do at Jews for Judaism is we explain why Messianic Judaism, which is in essence Christianity, and I'm sorry if somebody takes offense at that, but if you take the statement of faiths of the UMJC or the MJAA and you lay it next side by side with the statement of faith of Jews for Jesus, and you lay it side by side with the statement of faith of Campus Crusade for Christ, which is kind of a pan-denominational generic evangelical Christian organization, you will find that the wording is virtually the same. We did this in my class. We put them side by side and people were shocked that people who are calling themselves Messianic Jews are Christians. Now there are some other groups and people who say, well, I don't believe that, I don't, whatever. But the truth is that they are Christians, and this is not Judaism. It's not that faith. So what happened was one day last spring, I went to New York to do a training session for the Jewish Agency, to train their shaliachs on how to recognize people who are deceptively trying to make aliyah, because there are quite a number of them. In fact, that is part of the reason that we now have nearly 20,000 Israelis who believe in Jesus and are halachically Jewish. Okay? When I first joined Jews for Judaism 3 years ago, the number that was going around was that there were 100 Hebrew Christian congregations of some form in this country. Now the number is between 130 and 140. Okay? In just 3 years, it's grown that much. All right. So I was in New York and I was training these shaliachs what to look for. And one of the things that, well, I'll talk in a second about that. One of the shaliachs, who was an Israeli, who was a non-observant Israeli, said, so what's the problem? Now, I anticipated this question, because coming from his perspective, if you're going to stop someone from being a citizen based on their beliefs, then who's to say we couldn't kick him out of the country for his beliefs, which are different from, say, my beliefs, or Shas, or whoever, okay? He had a valid concern. And I explained to him that part of the problem is that evangelical, and I'm saying evangelical, so don't hear what I'm not saying, evangelical Christianity, part of the belief system is that you must tell others about your faith. You must bring them to a belief in Jesus. That's what the word evangelical means. It means missionary. It means spreading the good news. Okay? I said, if these people were simply saying, hey, we believe something different, leave us alone and let us be, there may be room for us to say, okay, fine, you're Meshugana, but whatever you want to believe is fine. But the problem is, they don't. They go out and they try to find people, and it's their raison d'etre. It's their reason for being. And so they do it, and they will not stop until they have accomplished their goal. Did you want to say something?
I would just add, our obligation, it's interesting, I'm sure we all learn, and we love to learn Torah. It's always good to have a Devar Torah sometime. I gave a little joke before. I'm sure it'll be repeated this Shabbos by someone. But there's an interesting Rashi. There's a pasuk in Sefer Devarim that says, when the Jews were about to enter into the land of Israel, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu warns the Jewish people, Lo lilmod la'asot, you should not learn to do the abominations of the nations that are there. And Rashi, based on a Gemara, says a very interesting thing. He says, why does it say Lo lilmod la'asot, don't learn to do? It could simply say, don't learn. Or it could have said, don't do. So the Gemara explains, and Rashi brings it down and says that it's teaching us that to learn the ways of the foreign people, the ways that are abomination to us, to do it, that's absolutely forbidden. But to learn it so that you can teach your children, so they won't be influenced, that's permissible. See the difference? So we have an obligation to educate ourselves and Jewish people so that they're not influenced and taken advantage of. We have an obligation that when we see manipulation and deception, when it does happen, to make that stand out. But there's both sides of the coin that we're obligated to do. It says, I have two favorite sayings. One's Latin and one's Aramaic. The Latin one you may have heard. It says, caveat emptor. For those that don't know, it means, buyer beware. Well, that's about